Amen. I feel like that song is a wonderful entree into the the word this morning and the preaching of the word. Have a seat, please. And thank you, worship team. It was a beautiful time of musical worship, so I'm grateful for the talents on display there and the efforts behind that, and being able to sing a song that's obviously very close to you as a congregation, particularly, which was quite moving. My name is Steve Early, and I'm married to Terry, who's over there. And both of my daughters, Frances and Alexandra, are here with us this morning. And as a family, we served as missionaries in Ethiopia with SIM. In fact, Terry and I met there in 1987. Obviously, I didn't start out from here in Australia. Something about the accent will probably give that away. She did. She started from South Australia, went out as a single missionary, and I left the U.S. About the same time. And one of the first people I met in Ethiopia was then Terry Frankel. So that isn't the sermon this morning. It is a story. It is a real story, but that's not the sermon this morning. But the point of that is that we served with SIM as a missionary family then in Ethiopia. We were there from 87 until till the end of 2008 in a church planting ministry. And the passage that I'm going to be speaking on, teaching from this morning, is a passage that has a lot of relevance for us as a family. And a lot of very personal meaning. And sometimes maybe because it's the Great Commission, isn't it? Those of you who know this passage, who know missions, will know this is the Great Commission. This is the passage preeminently that we usually point to when we talk about the challenge to go to the nations, to take the gospel to the nations. I'm going to read through it and come back to it. And I want to look closely at a few elements of this passage. There's more here than what we tend to give it credit for. So let's have a look at the passage. I'll read through it from verse 16. So this is chapter 28 of Matthew's Gospel, beginning at verse 16. Now the 11 disciples went to Galilee, to the mountain to which Jesus had directed them. And when they saw him, they worshipped him, but some doubted. And Jesus came and said to them, "All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Go, therefore, and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I've commanded you. And behold, I'm with you always to the end of the age." I'm sure that as a young missionary leaving the United States, being sent from my church in Seattle, Washington, back in 1987. I'm pretty sure this passage was actually preached at my commissioning. The church setting me apart, sending me off into the wild blue yonder or the wilds of Ethiopia. And in those days, they were a little bit wild, actually. But I'm pretty sure this was the passage that was used. And classically, it's the "go therefore and make disciples of all nations" that we usually toss at people from the pulpit, commanding or challenging them to consider calling to missions or the task of missions or what it's going to take to get the gospel out there to the nations, to all the nations, to all the peoples of the world. And typically, it's that very first part, the go, that's preached as the command. I'm sure it was at my commissioning. And there's nothing wrong with that, but the word "go" there is a little bit perhaps misleading in the way it's translated. And I'll look a little more closely at that phrase where it says, "Go therefore and make disciples of all nations." Go is not a command in the original version. It really says something more like "as you go," or "going," probably is a better translation. Going, make disciples. There's really only one command in that whole passage. And that command is make disciples of all nations. That's the only command there. And forgive me for the grammar here, those of you who weren't strong in English, but the command, second person plural imperative, right? Everybody's nodding their head. Yeah, oh, absolutely. Got it now, Steve. Let me unpack that for you. Second person, you, plural, because in Greek, you can say you to a group of people in a different way than you say you to an individual. Second person, plural, you all imperative command. Make disciples. So the one command there is to make disciples, and that command is given to you all. In the first instance, it's Jesus talking to his followers, right? But who is Matthew, who's giving us this account, writing this account for? And it's interesting because he's writing this account for the disciples that those disciples made, isn't he? Which is beautiful because what it says is the command was a credible and a reliable command. Something was going to happen as a result of this command. And the people to whom Matthew's writing this gospel are a reflection of that. They're the result of that. The willingness to follow this command results in the people who are reading this, for whom this account was given in the first instance. And they're also the proof that it's possible, which is important. Because remember, as Matthew says, this small group of people to whom Jesus is giving this command, some doubted. He's quite frank, which is interesting. So this is not a highly motivated, well-equipped, ready-to-move task force of missionaries. This is a ragtag group of followers of Jesus who still aren't quite sure. They know he's the Messiah, and they know he's going to do wonderful things, but they're not really even quite sure what those wonderful things are. And they're still trying to get their head around the fact that he's the Messiah. And here he is, standing in front of them, telling them as a group, you all, I'm telling you all, make disciples of what? Of Jerusalem, of the people of Jerusalem, right? Of the people that you know, the people in your neighborhood, the people you're close to. No. He says, make disciples of all nations, to this small group of people. And they're standing there and they're looking at him. Imagine yourself that you're one of them. They're standing there looking at him and they're saying, what? I mean, we're not even sure if it's safe for us to go back into the city. And you're telling us boldly to go out and to make disciples, not just of our own nation, but of all nations. So, important thing to pick up here, this is a command to not an individual to go. It's a command to the church, isn't it? In the first instance, what church there was in that moment, and it wasn't much, but it was an important beginning. And then those people who were the result of that first group of people, the disciples of the disciples. This is a command to them, first instance, to the next generation, second instance, and to us as the church. We're still that church. We inherit all of the things that Jesus passed on to that first group of people that he spoke to as a group, a fellowship. All of that redounds to us. We inherit all of that. So the challenge isn't for any one of you as an individual. Well, it may be. And if you have an idea about that or you're beginning to wonder, I'm happy to talk with you afterwards. I still work for the mission and I'm sure we can find a place for you. And let me say, Ethiopia is not as wild as it used to be. So don't have to be afraid. Actually, Ethiopia is still a little rough in some ways, but never mind that. But the point is, of course, that the command here is to us as the church. And so for me to say to you as a church, as a fellowship here in Norwood, this is a command. The one command here from Jesus is to you as a church to make disciples of all nations. You would be entirely justified in thinking, you're probably too pious, too good Christian to openly challenge that as an actual possibility to make disciples of all nations. But in your minds, and looking at yourselves as a church, you'd be completely justified in asking the question, we're off to a fairly good start as a church plant, and we're making some headway, and we're seeing some progress, and God is doing some wonderful things. But us as a fellowship, as a church, make disciple of all nations? Isn't that, surely, we can have a little place in that, perhaps, in that scheme of things. But to make disciples of all nations, us as a church, you would be entirely justified from a human standpoint in at least raising an eyebrow, and certainly in your heart, questioning, is that even possible? And how would we do that? But remember, again, to whom Jesus is speaking here in the first instance. He's speaking to a group of 11 followers, some of whom are doubting, all of whom are good Jewish men who are convinced that their role, whatever Jesus is telling them, is to make the Messiah known to the Jewish people, right? That's their responsibility. And anything outside of the Jewish people, that's got nothing to do with us. This is for us, the Jews. This is God's promise to us, and it's only for us. And so when Jesus looks them in the eyes and he says, you all make this go, as you go, going, make disciples of all nations. He's quite clear there. All peoples. Not just the Jews. So if this was confronting for you to say, okay, you as a church, the command, the call of Jesus is for you as a church is to make disciples of all nations. Imagine how much more confronting it was for him to stand there, their Messiah, and tell them, as good Jews, they were called to take the message and to make disciples of the very people they hated, the very people the Messiah was sent to overcome and to vanquish, and in a sense to wreak God's vengeance on for the sake of his people. And now Jesus is saying, those are the people, those are the very people I'm calling you to go out and make disciples of. So if this is challenging for you, it was 10 times more challenging and confronting for them. And Jesus called them to do it nevertheless. They're afraid, and they doubt, and they're not sure they even really understand what he's telling them to do. But he goes on. He says, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I've commanded you. And understand that a lot of the book of Matthew is really about Matthew's account of how Jesus was unpacking for the Jewish people the real God they worshipped, and not the one they had been told they worshipped. So much of it is about getting their heads clear from the voices in the background that are telling them what God is like in the many false ways, what God is like and what he expects of them, to really understanding who he truly is. In fact, how wonderful he truly is, how generous he truly is, how compassionate he truly is, how forgiving, absolutely revolutionary, how forgiving he truly is. So Jesus is even pointing out what he wants these people to take, the message he wants to take to these disciples that they're going to make in the nations. Teaching them to observe all I've commanded you, and this is the important part for them. And behold, I'm with you always to the end of the age. Now we look on our lives, we like to think, we come here at Sunday morning, and one of the things hopefully that being here together does is it reassures us of the real presence of God in our lives. And it should. This is a place preeminently where we should sense the presence of God, the approval of God, the genuine approval of God. He delights. He's quite clear about that. He delights in hearing us together singing praises to him and acknowledging him. That means a lot to his heart. And so it should be the case that we pick up on that. We have a sense of his presence, even of his approval. And that we can leave here with a sort of revived sense of God's presence with us. So we can go into Monday morning, we can go through the course of the week with this real keen sense that God is with us. He has promised to be with us. Jesus is very much a part of every element of our lives. But we can begin to assume that there's a sense in which we can expect that no matter what we do and no matter what choices we make. And I don't mean necessarily even really negative choices, but just independent choices. I have the life that has been set before me. I have my responsibilities. I have whatever demands there are on my life and so forth. And to fulfill those, I have to make certain choices, and I will do certain things. And maybe I will follow this career path, or maybe I will study this, or maybe I will take this direction in the course of my life. Maybe I'll spend a year off and just travel. And in all of that, there's this underlying assumption that Jesus is with us. Now, I don't mean to suggest for a minute that he's not, or that he never will be. But what I want to draw attention to is here, what he's telling these very, very unnerved disciples who are trying desperately to figure out what he's commanding them to do, because they take that seriously. It means a lot to them. They want to obey what he commands them to do. He says this, and behold, and it's important grammatic connection with what he's just said before that. I am with you always to the end of the age. So the point is this. Jesus is with us, of course. But if we want to experience the extent to which he's with us in doing what he set out to do, then we should ask ourselves the question, what's important to him? Not how he can be present with me in doing what's important to me, but what is important to him? And how can I engage with that? And how can I then experience his presence in a much more powerful, in a much more dramatic, in a much more intense way? Because I have given myself back to him to do what is important to him, not expecting him to follow along with me, doing what's important to me. And how that works and where that goes, that's between you and God. But it may not mean radical change. But one thing it does point to is what's important to Jesus is making disciples of those people out there. Not just those people outside the door, but those people in Kazakhstan, and those people in Ethiopia, and those people in Southeast Asia, the world, the nations, all the nations. That's important to Jesus. And I want to tell a story. You wouldn't have a missionary sharing at a missionary Sunday without telling you at least one missionary story, right? So I don't want to disappoint your expectations, so I'll tell you a story. In our experience in Ethiopia, one of the people groups that we worked with in church planning were a group of people called the Me'en people. The Me'en are a very traditional African people, tribal group that live in the far sort of southwest corner of Ethiopia. Down toward the border with Kenya and Sudan, if you look it up on your phone. At any rate, down a remote part of Ethiopia, very, very isolated group of people. Interestingly, they responded very openly to the gospel. In a short period of time after taking the message there and kind of sharing the gospel with those people, we weren't the first ones to do that. We kind of followed on the heels of our missionary colleagues. But in a very short period of time, really just in a few years, massive response among the whole people group to Christ. People, even whole villages, were sending messages asking for a gospel messenger to come to give them the story of Jesus. Many, many people coming to faith among that people group. It was a very exciting time. It was a really interesting place to be. Very unusual. Many missionaries can go through a whole career and never see anything like that. We sort of stepped in on the heels of our missionary colleagues who involved in that church planning effort. And the most remote part of the Me'en people was way down in the Omo River Valley lowlands, very remote, no roads down there, days and days to trek there if you went by foot. Very difficult place to get. But as a mission, we had the assistance of another mission called Heli Mission, and their thing was they operated helicopters to support missionary work in remote places. Brilliant, perfect connection. So our colleague, who was very gifted at the Me'en language and had been very successful in evangelism, he teamed up with the Heli Mission leadership, and they sent a helicopter to take him to some of those most remote places where even the other Me'en Christians, believers, were saying, you need to get the gospel right down to our people way down in the lowlands. So he made an initial trip, and he talked to a group of people in a small kind of bush village, shared the gospel with them, they were very responsive. And they said, like they did everywhere throughout Maine, come back. Come back and teach us. You've just scratched the surface. Okay, we know about Christ now. We know that God has organized this for us in the distant past, and He's prepared us for salvation. But what does that mean? How do we live? Now that we're believers, what difference does that make to our lives? So come back. And Ben said, all right, I'll do that. I'll come back. And I think he gave them a sort of a rough idea that he'd be back in a few weeks. And he made arrangements with the helicopter pilot. So we all understood, yeah, Ben's going to come back. He's going to teach us more. The time came. The helicopter arrived. It picked up Ben, took him off down to the Omo River Valley, and they went looking for this little village. And at this point, the story gets a little interesting because the helicopter pilot says, guess what? By the way, I didn't put in the GPS coordinates for that village when we were there last time. And Ben was sort of looking at him like, so you're expecting me to remember where that place was? We're hovering over this vast area of, hundreds of square miles of the Omo River Valley, and it all looks exactly the same. And you're expecting me to know exactly where we're going. And he said, well, no, I have a rough idea because I had, I followed compass coordinates, one thing and another, but I just don't have the exact location. So they're kind of looking at each other, and they're Christians, so there's a moment of mutual forgiveness, let's call it. At any rate, they're flying out there over the Omo River Valley, and they can't find this village. They know it's probably fairly close, but they can't find this village. And it would be a difficult place to find. There's a lot of scrub down there. When I say village, these are semi-nomadic people. They don't build towns and cities. They live in temporary accommodation wherever they go. But eventually they were at the point where the helicopter pilot is sort of tapping the fuel gauge saying, we've really only got a short period of time. I can't do this forever. And they were thinking about turning back when they saw a village with a large group of people. And they knew that wasn't the place they were looking for, but they thought, well, probably they'll know where we should be, or they'll know the place that we're looking for. So they came, they landed. They thought it was a bit strange that there were so many people there, because again, these are semi-nomadic people. They're off in the bush, looking after their cattle and their goats, and protecting them from raiders or from wild animals or whatnot. So they're rarely together in one place in large numbers, but there's a large group of people in this village. They land the helicopter, they get out. Ben walks up to the man who's obviously the leader of this community, and the man says, before Ben can say a word, the people are here. And Ben's sort of looking around and thinking, well, I don't think this is what the village I'm sure this isn't where I was meant to come, but the people are definitely here. And he said, he kind of looking around, he said, why are you all here like this? And the man said, I called the people together. They're all here now. And again, there's this moment of, I'm meant to understand what that means, but I don't understand what that means. How can we clarify this? So Ben asked a few more questions, and finally the guy, I think he was getting a little exasperated at this point with Ben because, it's obviously the people are here, right? So he says, 3 nights ago, I had a dream. And in my dream, a voice spoke to me and it said, in 3 days' time, a messenger will come to you from the sky to share to you the word of Christosi, by whose name the people will be saved. I heard that 3 days ago. This is the third day. You've just come from the sky. I called the people together because we knew you were coming. Now they're here and they're ready to hear about Christosi. So tell them about Christosi. And Ben looks at the helicopter pilot, and the helicopter pilot looks back at Ben and he says, tell them about Christosi. So he did. He spent the rest of the day sharing the gospel with those people. And of course, at the end of it, the leader of that group, the leader of that village says, is there anything to stop us from believing now and accepting the forgiveness of Christ? And they all raised their hands and they said, they made their commitment there on the spot. The point is, Ben, in going to that, and even in answering the call to the command to make disciples of all nations. He didn't know what he was going to find when he left that morning and he went off in that helicopter. And he didn't know, and the helicopter pilot with him, when they landed that helicopter, didn't know what they were going to find. And what they did find was Jesus. Jesus was there, well ahead of them. And he had been. He'd certainly been there at least 3 days before them, and probably a lot longer than that, if you really understood what was going on, for these people to be so ready for the message to come when it finally did. And again, it wasn't just that village, it was a whole people group. Ben, in answering the command, in responding to the command, and it's important to understand, he didn't do this alone. He did this as part of a church that sent him to be in Ethiopia and to be preaching the gospel to the Mayan people. He was highly aware of the fact, and he was constantly in touch with that church about the importance of their role in this process. He wasn't there as an individual, he was there as part of a church. And what did he find? He found in that village, in that very remote part of southwest Ethiopia, that Christ was with him, exactly as he promised to be, in a dramatic and in an intense way, because he was doing what Jesus commanded his church to do. So the question for you, and it's a challenge, I won't back off of this, it's a challenge for you as a church. When you read here in this passage, Jesus telling his followers, make disciples of all nations. First question, do you really believe that's possible? And I don't blame you if you question. I mean, even Matthew is honest enough to say, some doubted. Of this small group that is closest to Jesus, even of them, some doubted. Do you believe it's even possible? Secondly, as a church, are you willing to accept the challenge? Because this is not a challenge to any one of you to go. It's a challenge to you as a church, first and foremost, to believe in the possibility that if you are willing to make disciples of all nations, whatever that means for you as a church, you will find Jesus wherever you go to do that. And you will find him in ways that you would never expect or believe. And that's my challenge to you. So